Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
So welcome to today's event, Storytelling for Change, with Cate May Burton, Anuradha Rao, Dr. Lynne Quarmby, Sylvia Olsen, and Nafeesa Alibhai. The panel will be moderated by Cate May Burton, who will introduce the panel. So I would like to introduce her before she introduces the others. So Cate May Burton is an educator, activist, and author. She is beginning work as an elementary teacher while completing a PhD at the Social Justice Institute at the University of British Columbia. She co-authored the new book, Growing Up Elizabeth May, a story about her mother, Elizabeth May's journey into activism as a young girl. And I really feel it's an honor to have you all here today as part of the Banyan community and both the audience and each of you panelists. So thank you so much. And I turn it over to you, Cate.
Thank you so much, Jacob. And thank you to everyone who has come to attend this event, and really, really grateful to the four speakers who are here, who are all friends of mine who I love, and who are just the most awesome, inspiring people I can think of to have together in one discussion panel. I want to add an acknowledgement of the unceded Indigenous lands where each of us is living across Turtle Island, wherever we are. For myself, that's the land of the Hunkaminam-speaking Musqueam people. And in this event in particular, we have connections to environment, land, and waters, because we're thinking about climate change and ecological struggles. And we also have connections to story. Story being fundamental to who we are. And that's a much more well-valued and recognized part of Indigenous teachings than it traditionally has been for my ancestors on the British Isles. So stories everywhere being so valuable and important is why we're here. And just recognizing that, as Thomas King says, we have to be careful about the stories that we tell and careful about the stories that are told to us. And I also wanted to really profusely thank Persephone Brewing for helping us today. They gave us a generous sponsorship for this event. And they're a really wonderful business doing a farm brewery in Gibsons on the Sunshine Coast, and including doing community food boxes. So in that spirit, wanted to really thank them for showing up for community today. And I also wanted to take a pause to just acknowledge that there's been a lot of pain for many of us, and we witnessed a lot of grief just in the last 2 or 3 weeks. And some of that has to do with the violence of colonization, and some of it has to do with the violence of racial oppression and those histories. So I just want to take a sec to say that myself as a settler, I know that I'm not separate from Indigenous peoples or from peoples who experience racialization. And so that connectedness is part of the reason stories are the theme of this panel. And it's also something I just wanted us to pause to think of the way that we're all connected, and just to say that this has been a hard moment for many people. Okay, so to the housekeeping business, please keep yourselves muted during the panel talk. If you have questions, I would ask you to keep them on your heart and write them down if you need to remember them. And we'll have a Q&A after the panel is over. Our panel will last about an hour, and then we'll pause and have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Okay, so with that, I'm so pleased to start us off. The first part of our program is going to just be having each of our panelists share some part of their work or who they are and how they come into the work of storytelling and environment and climate. So we'll start with Dr. Lynne Quarmby. Lynne is a super brave scientist, author, and activist. She teaches cell biology at Simon Fraser University. And she and her trainees have published numerous research papers on something called snow algae, which is colloquially called watermelon snow. So the book she wrote, which I will hold up here, Watermelon Snow, Science, Art, and a Lone Polar Bear, follows her Arctic Sea adventure with a group of artists rather. And though she was searching for snow algae, as you read the book, you find that she is searching for a way through the emotional weight of climate change. So through her stories of being a scientist, then being arrested on Burnaby Mountain, and then even attempting a run at federal politics, Lynne's book is a glimpse into humility, commitment to the biosphere, and becoming resilient with the challenges that we face. So I'm grateful to Lynne for kicking us off.
Wow, thank you very much, Kate. Thank you for that very thoughtful welcome to the event and for the warm and generous introduction. I'm honored to both be your friend and to be here. Kate pretty much summed things up. I thought what I would do today is start just by reading the first page of my book, because it sets up the journey that I've been through in the last couple of years, which I wasn't really understanding when I started it. At the beginning, when I went on this Arctic trip, I thought I was there for my science, but I thought I was also there to recover from burnout. And no doubt burnout was part of the package, but what I came to understand on the ship, and partly on the ship and partly in writing the book and telling the stories afterwards, I came to understand that what was really happening was that I was dealing with unprocessed grief. Grief about the changes that are happening in our world, the changes that aren't happening, that need to be happening. A deep grief that in its own way was a form of climate denial. So I'm just going to read the first page and then we can move along to the next introduction. There is nothing but ice, sea, and sky, whatever direction I look. I walk the perimeter of the flow, never closer than a meter from the edge, as much as I long to peer straight down. The air is still, the water calm and clear. An adjacent ice floe plunges several meters below the surface in diminishing turquoise contours. Above the water, the ice edge glows lapis blue, reflecting like a glaze on the turquoise below. Nearby, a pair of eiders swims along an ice edge. Above the ice, horizontal clouds line up in a dozen soft, thin rows, subtle swaths of gray, pink, and dusty purple, the color of a fresh-picked plum before you polish it for eating. My eyes fill with tears. After years of fighting for political action on global warming, civil disobedience, lawsuits, a run for parliament, hearing about, reading about, and seeing various graphs of melting summer sea ice, here I stand on an actual sheet of melting summer sea ice, bearing witness. It's emblematic of our warming world. It's an abstraction, and yet also cold, hard, blue, real. I quietly weep. I see the melting away of democracy and the melting of the ice, and I know these are tightly entwined. Joining many others, I poured my soul into the work. We have barely made a dent in altering the course of business as usual. Out here on the flow edge, I'm struggling with burnout and despair. I'm traveling on a schooner, a scientist on an artist's residency. The voyage, and the book it conjured, is a search for rational, meaningful responses to the global environmental crisis. A search for life beyond despair. And I think that's part of what we're all here for today. So thank you, Cate.
Thank you, Lynn. So good to have you. And we're going to next move to Nafeesa. Nafeesa is just a very thoughtful and patient climate justice organizer in their student communities. They're a Koja settler who's shared their intergenerational connections to places and histories as a way into greater forms of solidarity and strengthening community. And they connect their peers with deeper learnings towards justice, liberation, and truth. And they connect their studies in life sciences and health with planetary health and the social and cultural forms of health and wellness. And I know Nafeesa just recently in the past year from volunteering together at the UBC Climate Hub. And Nafeesa is also active with Climate Justice UBC and other community groups. So welcome, Nafeesa, and please share a little bit about yourself and stories.
Yeah, thank you for the warm introduction, Cate. For this event, Cate asked us for our own little bios or introductions, and I think Cate just kind of said it better than I can say it myself sometimes. Now we know why she's the one with the real, well, she has a book and I don't. I'm working on one, we'll get there soon. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. I'm really excited to be here among such beautiful brains. I wanted to share that today I will be giving my honorarium to the survivors of residential schools. And you can do the same through this link here, which I will share in the chat right now. I don't really know if I'm a settler or unwelcome guest or uninvited guest or what, but I'm definitely, this is not my land. The lands that my family were on, they were taken from us in a lot of different ways. And so it feels as if we're floating a little bit. But if I can help someone get their home back or feel that sense of belonging and of pride in belonging a little bit more, then I will absolutely be doing that. Yeah, I think a lot about introductions because that's a bit of a story itself. It's how we pitch ourselves to the world. And, you know, in academic context, I'd say my name along with publications and my research experience. I am the sum of my experiences. But in a lot of ways, I think that sells myself short because it doesn't give a sense of what I can do. It doesn't give a sense of like my morals and what I want to do. I'm thinking of this piece by Josue Rivas, who is a Mexico Otome photographer and storyteller, who founded the Standing Strong project and Natives Photograph. And the way they introduce themselves is by saying, "I'm a future ancestor." And I think that's a really beautiful way of introducing yourself, because it shows that you are not existing in isolation. You are part of a collective, and not just a collective that exists now, but a collective that transcends temporality, or that transcends time. And so Josue says that knowing that he is a future ancestor changes how he lives his life. And I think that's been something that changes my life as well, especially knowing the stories of my ancestors, and, you know, people as close as my grandmother. So I'll leave it at that, just to think about that piece there, and pass it back to Cate to introduce someone else. So thank you all.
Thank you, Nafeesa. That was a very beautiful introduction to some of the themes that you've brought up in these spaces that I think are so important for us to reflect on. And I'm now very excited to introduce my friend Anu Rao. Anu is a strong environmental protector and a joyful one. She has worked in research, conservation, restoration, stewardship in coastal ecosystems here in Canada, as well as in 12 other countries, and currently lives on unceded Coast Salish territories. And she follows her teachings from her Indian heritage as well as Indigenous knowledge holders, and connects that in with how she thinks about science. Which is one theme that I hope we'll touch on more as we go on with our panel. And her book, which I have to hold up here, One Earth, People of Color Protecting Our Planet, is a beautiful book. It's for middle years audience, so you could bring it in for your kids or grandkids in middle school, high school, but it's a great book for adults too. She shares there the stories of many incredible environmental protectors, and how their backgrounds and their living experiences are part of their connections to themselves, their communities, nature, and how they do the work of taking care of their home and their ecological location. So this is a book full of insight about how we form connections to nature, to ourselves, to the people around us. And I'm very happy to pass it to Anu to tell us a little more.
Thank you so much, Cate. It's so much of an honor to be here with all of these wonderful people, and to do this with you. Cate and I have known each other since she was very young, and I was older, but younger than I am now. So it's really nice to come together like this. I'll start by acknowledging that I'm here. I am an uninvited settler on the traditional and ancestral and stolen territories of the Humathgrim, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And I'm on an active journey to figure out how to decolonize my own life and my own work as a descendant also of people who have been displaced environmentally as well as politically. And it's really hard to follow Nafeesa's intro because you're amazing. And I'm also inspired to donate my honorarium to the residential school survivors. So thank you for being an inspiration already. And yeah, I never considered myself a storyteller, and Cate invited me to be a panelist, and this is one of many events I've done this week, and most of them I've been organizing, so it's nice to kind of sit back and be a little bit taking a different role. And it's nice to come full circle as well. My book was launched at the beginning of the pandemic shutdowns by Banyan. And I think it was their first virtual book launch. I think Jacob was still figuring out how to press record on the system, and now it's super slick. Everyone's really good at it, and you've done so many since then. And so it's so nice to come back and see you all again and receive that warmth from Banyan again a year later. We're still in this, but we're in it together. And I was thinking, what do I have to say about storytelling? And then I realized that, well, I have a book that tells story that, I've got this, I'll tell you the story of my story within this book of 20 stories. So maybe I am a storyteller, and I think the best way to explain it or synthesize it is in the introduction that I put in here. So I'm just going to read to you from this. Who is an environmental defender? What do they look like? Maybe like you, maybe like me. I've worked and volunteered in the environmental field since the 1990s, but I've often felt like the odd one out. Only one other person in my family has gone into this line of work, and at work, I've usually been the only one with a brown face. And it makes me feel a bit weird. I don't have the same traditions or listen to the same kind of music as my colleagues. I celebrate different holidays. I was born in Canada, but my mother tongue isn't English, and no one can pronounce my name. My ancestors fled environmental crisis in the north of India more than 2,000 years ago, and religious persecution in Goa 500 years ago. My grandfather was a freedom fighter against a colonial system imposed on India. That history shapes me and makes me different from most of the people I have worked with. I can move fluidly between both worlds, family and work, but I end up hiding a bit of my true self from almost everyone. I know I have one identity, not two. My culture and my passion for the earth are linked. Being different isn't bad though, because I navigate between cultures every day. It's easy for me to be a bridge between groups of people who wouldn't otherwise talk to each other. Very few people of color seem to be at the forefront of the environmental movement. Others exist in places where we tend not to look. They save animals, stop destruction, research solutions, fight for health and justice, and do many other brave things. Some risk their lives defending nature. When I was looking for people to interview for this book, I found more than I could possibly include. I could have written an entire book about environmental defenders of color in Vancouver, where I live, or a whole book about Indigenous protectors of culture, land, and water. But one goal of this book is to showcase diversity in background, location, age, and interest. I chose to focus on 20 environmental defenders, and in this book, I tell you about what they're defending and how their cultures and backgrounds influence their work and the words and wisdoms they share to inspire you. They're the role models I wish I'd had when I was younger. And now I have some of them now. So thank you again.
So wonderful. Thank you, Anu. We're going last to Sylvia Olsen. Also an amazing friend. Sylvia is a brilliant storyteller who does so many things. She's a powerful writer, she's a knitting designer, she's a housing specialist and teacher. Her work ranges from picture books to history, and she has a new book out called Unraveling Canada that explores knitting cultures and Canada's history and a cross-country road trip that she did, which is super fun and cool. And I was lucky to be able to work with Sylvia recently on the book that she and I have published here, Growing Up Elizabeth May, The Making of an Activist. And that's my mom on the cover, Elizabeth May there. And it was a pleasure to work with Sylvia. This is also a book for middle readers, but I would say it's definitely also a book that adults can enjoy. And you can see like kind of some cool retro pictures This is the kind of thing that makes the book special, I think, is it's connected to family, it's connected to history, and it tells stories of social and environmental movements through personal story. So I will hand it over to Sylvia to share a little bit more.
Thanks, Cate. It was pretty awesome to work with Cate, seriously. I didn't have a story about Elizabeth. If you can believe it, all of us that know Elizabeth, what do you mean you didn't have a story about Elizabeth? Well, I had a whole ton of stories about Elizabeth, but as a storyteller, I couldn't get the story. I just couldn't get the story. The truth is, I think there is, this was for middle school. I had worked on this with Jean Jordan, note to Jean Jordan. She was the inspiration for this book. Sylvia, you need to write this book. Couldn't find the story. I found out that Elizabeth, I see it was for middle school kids, right? But I found out that Elizabeth actually wasn't a kid. She really wasn't ever a kid, I don't think. And I actually wasn't much of a kid either. So how did two people that weren't really kids write this book, this biography? And it was my husband, Tex, who you'll see his face in the crowd, said, Cate will help you get the story. And so she did. So we have this beautiful story about Elizabeth May as a child, as a young activist. And as Cate said, I've written all sorts of things, random. I actually have the inspiration and then sort of figure out after what who the audience is and how old the audience is. But for now, because this is one of my middle school age books, I will speak to you and introduce myself to you as the grandmother of 8 children and the mother of 4 children. And the Olsen family is a bit of a crowd. And I feel now most, I don't know, obligated, worried, concerned, interested in the 8 grandchildren. It's not about Sylvia. It's really not about Sylvia anymore. It's about the 8 of them. They range from 5 to 24. And the world makes them anxious. The world made me anxious too. Those of us, I think a lot of you are my age in the crowd, you know, we were worried. We were worried about nuclear. We were worried about threats to our existence. But I'm not sure we worried like the kids worry. I don't think we worried because I thought, and you know, there was something after. The kids are worried. So my stories started out. I'm a storyteller first. I'm a writer second. It's very different things, actually, storytelling and writing. I found out that I wasn't a writer, knowing I was a storyteller. But I started writing stories about getting along, you know, and it wasn't in the environment of today, serious. It was very, very different narrative that was going on in those days. But I lived in a world, a mixed cultural world of a blonde, blue-eyed girl living in an Indigenous community. And I looked out my kitchen window and wrote stories about how we get along or how we don't. And we do and we don't. And they were very simple stories, just stories about the kids that I saw at my kitchen window. My kids who are Coast Salish kids, the other Coast Salish kids, and kids that look like me. And I have a son who is a Brazilian who came and lived with us, and he's been part of our family for about 30 years. So this mixed kind of group of children, and I wrote those kind of stories. But Elizabeth's story, and the theme of today was to write something to tell a story first. You'll hear it later. I don't tell a story to teach a lesson. I don't. But tell stories that kids can read and say, hey, there's a way around there's something we can do to empower kids. Your voice, kids. Seriously, there are no kids in this audience, but we all often talk at schools. I do. Your voice, not only is it important, but there's this false narrative out there that you're silent. No, you don't have to be, because if there was a child in this group right here, we would we would defer to them. We would listen to them. We would give them all the attention. And so we should. But kids don't know that yet. Well, lots of kids do. Lots of kids are learning that. And the more kids that learn that, and the more kids that see what they can do, the better off. So that's why I wrote Elizabeth May's book, because she's been a kid that spoke ever since she could speak, I think, about the things that are important to her. So that's just me. Mostly for this, I am a grandmother. My second granddaughter is graduating today, and one by one they're growing up. And I think my role in this world is there for sure. So, a land acknowledgement. I am looking out at the Salish Sea. So while we want a land acknowledgement, my kids are Coast Salish kids, and I just got to put a word in for the Salish Sea, because that is such a critical part of our family's reality, is the sea and the fish, and the relationship that my family, the Coast Salish family of mine, have to the sea is really quite extraordinary. So that's me. Part of me.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yeah, you are a fantastic storyteller. I can tell that you're a storyteller first, and I hope everyone can follow up on these brief introductions where we didn't have enough time to actually dig into these books and these awesome people. But we're going to shift gears into some more high-level kind of ideas. Which is my kind of bent, and that's I wrote these questions, and they are too big. I know that these are too big questions. We have 3 of them to try to do in less than 30 minutes, and I want to try to have all 4 of you respond to each one. So it might be completely unsatisfactory at the end to realize that we haven't had enough of a chance to unpack the material, but we're just gonna do a little taster for each question. So the first question is about knowledge. You all have different combinations of knowledge where you draw lessons from. A couple of you are scientists, a couple of you are researchers. I think we're at a critical moment in the world we live in, because there is so much misinformation. There's a crisis of whether people trust knowledge, whether they have access to reliable knowledge, and at the same time, there is a need to broaden knowledge and acknowledge just how much learning and teaching is happening that doesn't get recognized and legitimated by Western institutions and universities. So with that in mind, I'd like each of you to talk about, how do stories fit into that picture for you? How do you bring knowledge into story? And we'll start this one with Nafeesa, please.
Oof, it's not a tough question to answer at all. Yeah, I think a lot about this, and recently I've been kind of introduced to the idea that our very existence in this capitalist world is, we base our being on what we know. We define ourselves by what we know. And I've been really struggling with that, I think, because I think I'm so much more than what I know. It doesn't leave space for what I feel and what I want and what I need and what I give, and what others need, want, feel, give, and I guess know to some extent as well. So I think the question was, how do we bring knowledge into stories? But I think stories have so much to them that, yes, we could consider knowledge, and that is an important part. But I think sometimes, like, what I'm focusing on now especially is, how do I enjoy a story without having to put a lesson into it, like Sylvia was saying. I think sometimes it's enough to just see yourself and to enjoy something. to be like spontaneously playful with what you're doing. I just wrote a little story about just an intimate encounter I had with someone for a magazine, and there was really nothing to learn there. It was just kind of, I had some fun. But I found the response to it was really like generous and welcoming. Because sometimes it's nice just to read something happy. And I think that has some depth coming from me. I'm queer, I'm not cis, and that's about as clearly as I can define that. I am brown, I'm a Muslim, and that there aren't always happy stories told about us. So again, this idea of bringing knowledge into stories is not always top of mind for me. But to actually answer the question, I would like to talk about how like science is brought to people's lives. I think it's often posed as like this like opposite to the arts, and that's certainly how I thought of it growing up as well. You were either a science kid or an arts kid or right brain or left brain, or left brain or right brain actually, and there was no room for kind of multiple perspectives or multiple truths in science as I was growing up. And then I got to like quantum physics, and then you find out that an electron can be in two places at one time, and then you're like, well, just so confused and not sure what to do with that. But I want to think of this electron a little bit, and I kind of draw inspiration from it, because I think everything that we observe, everything that we perceive, especially in science, that is we kind of assume very arrogantly that we can describe the world in a way that is accurate, but our senses are so limited. We have like we can only see so many colors, whereas like mantises can see like 10 times what we can see. We can't hear the way a dog or a cat can hear, and I know this because my cat often perks up at noises that I have missed. So this idea of us being able to tell like an objective story in science, I think, is really flawed. And the idea that this is pushed is kind of an untruth that is really pervasive. So yeah, I am thinking of that electron. I'm thinking of focusing on that a little bit younger too, and just knowing that there are multiple truths and multiple facts, and we cannot presume that we can know everything ever, really. So there's some humility to that. And I'd like to kind of acknowledge like the power of stories to do that. You can have, I don't know how many stories there are about, a kid who has like some like dream and then they go and achieve it, right? Or stories about the same event and you're seeing it from multiple perspectives. And I think that's really where I love stories, where you can see the same event or the same moment in so many ways. I think that kind of answered the question. I might have gone off on my own tangent there, but yeah, thank you, Cate. And I'm excited to see or to hear what everyone else says.
Thank you, Nafeesa. I appreciate that you challenged me on the premise of my question. We don't have very much time, so instead of going around to every single panelist on this question, I wonder if anyone would volunteer to follow up on what Nafeesa said, if you have something that comes to mind right away for you in terms of building on that idea of story. Yes, Anu, please.
Just to quick things, and that was a really, yeah, really deep understanding of everything. But there's two things. So one is when you're writing a story, we're told to write what you know, and that the best stories come when you're writing from what you know, which is kind of where I came from. And then as Nafeesa's talking about science and the application to science, you know, I keep thinking about these biologists that I interact with, or I mean, not anymore so much now, because I think I'm working with the woke now, and I'm working with a lot of Indigenous organizations now, and First Nations. So back in the day, a lot of the biologists I would work with would be trying to understand the story of the land, and like that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to figure out what nature is doing and the stories that they're telling. But if they're not looking at the broader knowledge that's been there all along, they're only seeing this tiny portion. And so I'll just end with a quote from Chief Leah George Wilson that I quote pretty much in every event that I do. So if you've heard me before, you may have heard this, but she says that 10,000 years of knowledge is science. And I like to say it twice just because it's awesome. 10,000 years of knowledge is science. And if quote unquote biologists start to recognize that, I think we'll all understand the world a lot better.
Awesome. Thank you, Anu and Nafeesa. Those are really, as Anu said, those are deep reflections. And I'm sure we could talk about this for a whole hour with the four of you here, but I'm gonna switch to the next question in the interest of time. And we'll start out with Sylvia on this question, which is moving from the head to the heart. So Nafeesa kind of already brought in the fact that these aren't separate. Actually, knowledge is heart knowledge, and the reciprocal is true of our feelings and our emotional worlds, that they are knowledge as well. But I want to go to Sylvia and kind of ask about, in relation to environment, you talked about your kids having a feeling of anxiety. How do you think stories can help us in that moment?
I think stories, I want to get just a little notion of, are you writing fiction or are you writing nonfiction? And when we're talking about story, and that's a distinction that our teaching and our education system is set up for us. And it's one that we can actually get rid of completely when we're talking about stories, because stories are neither fiction nor are they nonfiction. I'm an academic, and Dr. Sylvia Olsen does a lot of things with bullets. But when you tell a story, you get in it, you get in trouble. Every story, you get in trouble, and then you kind of pull yourself out. And if there's anything that young people need today, is to see that they've got some other people. They're reading about other people that have these struggles. So when you are struggling, a story is something that you can read or you can hear. I like to tell stories. I think I actually like to tell stories even better than I like to write them. But you can find something in that story that you can relate to at that moment that helps you just feel less alone, feel less afraid. And I really, let me look at that name, Nafeesa. The lighter, the better, for lots of, particularly today, stories that just support our humanity, our shared humanity. We are right now not sharing humanity. We're not sharing anything. We're very edgy, be it COVID or whatever. Humans are feeling edgy right now, against each other, between each other, and between the environment. So stories, for all of us, not just kids, but they hear something. I get the weirdest stuff back from people that read my stuff and say, oh, on page 37, oh my gosh, I so related to that. And I go back to page 37 and think, oh, really? Really? So I don't write stories with any intention of somebody relating to really anything. Because that's me running in front of my audience, trying to figure out what they might like and then trying to feed it to them. after you've read a few, written a few books and get your feedback, you find out that the weirdest and the most unexpected things are what they relate to. So I think it has to do with feeling less alone right now, feeling hopeful that humans together can be encouraging with each other, a little bit of lightness, and then absorbing yourself into something. That's how we're all going to get through. That's all. That's as profound as I can be right now, Kate.
Thank you, Sylvia. No, I really appreciate that your perspective that you bring is often like very like down to earth. Like, let's talk about how it really is, and I really appreciate that. And I'm interested to hear what you think about this question. You know, reading your book really did kind of give a lens into what climate grief does to a person, what eco-anxiety really looks like. So how does that feel for you to think of stories? How do they help us?
So yeah, stories, my head is being flooded by all the different things I want to say and what to say first. I want to respond a little to what we've heard and then cycle back to this. I hear Sylvia and Nafeesa and talking about lightness, and I feel that that is something that I struggle with. I feel quite heavy in the world, and everything is always so serious, and I struggle to find that lightness, and that was something that I really had to focus and work on in the book, because it is a book about pain, and it is so essential to make it accessible in that way. And similarly, you know, with 30 years of being a scientist, I'm just always so serious about how does that thing work? And I feel that it's really important to tell these stories for many reasons. One of them is I feel it's important to tell my stories as a scientist, as who I am. And I feel when I hear other things said about science, often I kind of tighten up a little bit because it's not how it feels to me being a scientist. And I feel so, I spent most of my career investigating the molecular machines of life. You know, how do cells work? And using the tools of biochemistry and molecular biology and all kinds of microscopy to extend. Nafeesa was talking about our limits on our perceptions and the wavelengths we can see. Well, this is one of the wonderful things science does, both in its approaches and in its technology development, is to expand both in time and scale, how small we can see, how big we can see, how far into the past we can see. And I was listening to Anu and hearing about how deep we go, and that is absolutely true in my world. And you go so deep that as a scientist, we're telling each other stories all the time. Every time we write a paper, every time we apply for a grant, it's always in the form of story, but we're telling stories to one another. No one else has the language. No one else is down that dark, dark tunnel that we're down. And frankly, it's what you think about in the shower or when you're playing catch with your kid. You're thinking about, you know, that next experiment and what controls you're going to do. And it's hard to engage in the bigger world. And I felt that once I really, I had an experience of not getting a grant renewed. And so I had less money, less students, less work to do. All of a sudden I could pay more attention to the world, and there was no going back. but at the same time, having lived so long in that world, I have this deep respect for the scientists that are doing that. And I fully appreciate and understand the need for them to stay deep and the benefit that we all get from that. And so I think it takes all of us, and I think it takes people like me emerging from that world and telling some of those stories to give others a glimpse into it. Very tempting to go on, and I am a university professor, so I can talk for a very long time, and I'll stop right here.
I appreciate that, Lynn. I knew you would want to reflect on science as story, but I do want to go back to you on the question of your book's emotional weight. I know it is for me as well. I often stay in the place of emotional weight instead of lightness, but of course they're reciprocal experiences, and I would really appreciate your thoughts about what did your story do for you when you were telling it. Yeah,
I think the simplest thing that I can maybe put into words now is that it put me in a place of looking directly at the issues. And so I think until I sat down to really think this through and to think about what I was struggling with, I had some illusions about the level of change I could precipitate, or that I had an illusion that I could make more happen than I had been able to make happen. And so it allowed me to look really clearly at the things that I was afraid of, the things that I was depressed about, the limits of what any of us can do as individuals. And by looking directly at it, I was able to come to better terms with it. And even the fact of having a book out in the world, I still struggled, with this fantasy of what that book would do and how it would launch and the impact it would have. Well, no one book does that. What we're all doing is our little pieces. And by writing all these different books from all these different perspectives with all these different audiences, we are shifting the culture. And shifting the culture is what opens us to the real change. So I don't know if that quite gets at it, what you were talking about. I did cry a lot as I was writing the book.
Yeah.
Kate, can I just add something to that from Lynn is a scientist and I'm a academic historian, and the stories that historians have told for years have got us where we are today. So the project also is to restory. And back to what Nafeesa said about head and heart, and there isn't head and heart. There's all those things, but there is something about needing better knowledge, and historians have been culpable for years of telling stories that aren't true. They aren't true. So there is this deep hole that you get in. And when I was doing my PhD on the history of housing in First Nations, I literally cried and felt like throwing up every day, like many days, because of this deep hole that you get in, and you're listening to what's been told, and this need to shift. And then the reality that Lynn was the reason I wanted to speak, that Lynn just said, that you can make about that much of difference, which is cool. That's something, right? When you're all said and done, right?
Awesome. Yeah, that is it, right? I thought that was a great takeaway from your book, Lynn, that everyone is doing different things in a different way in different parts of life. But, if everyone is acknowledging that there has been historic wrong, that we need to restory, that, that climate change is an urgent crisis, that we all need to bring those pieces together, then it's going to gradually shift. And that gets us into our third and final question, but I do want to give an opportunity to Anu or Nafeesa to respond to anything that you've heard in the last few minutes before we take to the last question. Maybe
I can leave it in, perhaps.
Okay, I'll start with the last question and I'll go to you, Nafeesa, but you can feel free to, jump back as we have been this whole time. So the last question is how we can motivate each other to act, and how stories can be part of that experience as well. So how do stories help us to actually make change? Not just in how we shift our thinking and our sense of self, but also the actions that we then take.
I'm actually going to ask you, Anu, if you could start us off on this one, if you don't mind.
Oh, I was looking forward to you starting us off. I can try. It's hard. I think that's a hard thing, and it goes to what I think what Sylvia was saying is you never know how the stories that you tell are going to affect somebody else, because, and I've heard this from another author as well, that you can't predict who your audience is going to be. I mean, I partially predicted who my audience was going to be. I did quite target the work to the audience, but I mean, there's a couple of things. You put it out there, and then you allow people to make those connections and humanize each other, and hopefully make that change within themselves by then seeing people as relatable and understanding the world from a different perspective. And the more you put out that diversity of voices out there, I mean, the fact that you choose the stories, and whoever is choosing to put out the stories and distribute the stories, and whose stories those are that are getting out there, and that's getting into the restorying as well. I mean, that's the change happening right there as well. And we're influenced by what we see and what we read, and if you don't see that diversity, then you only believe the one thing that you're being fed. And so I think that is the very first step in all of this, is to see this diversity in there, and to see the other ways, and to see the way out and of the trouble through different eyes. So I'll leave that there and kind of hand it over to Nafeesa to carry on from that.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate you starting us off. I really resonate with this idea of being able to see something through different eyes. I think that's immensely important. But I think I'd like to think a little bit about like the temporality, or like the sense of time in a story. So I have survived a lot of trauma, and I think one way that I have coped with this is by putting a story to it. Because one thing about trauma, as a neuroscientist or someone who studies, the brain, I have some sense of what that looks like. And a way that it manifests trauma is that it doesn't seem like it ends ever. That's kind of what PTSD is, right? You have flashbacks to these things, but they feel really real and really present. And so I really appreciate the power of a story to give us a beginning, a middle, and an end. But especially this part of the end, because then you're out of that. And I'm really careful about where I apply this beginning, middle, and end of a story. Because I think in real life, it's like really difficult to say, like, this is the beginning of this is the middle of it, and this is the end of it. I mean, an example that I can draw from high school is like different teachers arguing about when World War I actually ended, because and when it actually started. Like, was it way back when with the Austro-Prussian War, or was it like actually in the 1900s? And I think this like attempt to see something as linear, to see something as finite, is really soothing. but I think we should be really careful where we apply it, because we can cut off things that are still going on. We can silence voices. And Sylvia, you're talking a lot about how like kids, children, if we find that our voices are not listened to, or that we don't really have a voice. But and Kate, about how your mom just had this voice her whole life. And I think something that you said earlier, Kate, just made me think of that. And you're saying these historical harms that have been going on, and how we have a responsibility to retell those stories. But I think one part of that retelling would be to acknowledge that it's not over. Particularly with the residential schools and the genocide of Indigenous peoples. We can look to the foster system. We can look to the housing crisis. We can look to the way that they're treated in like medical facilities. And we can look to kind of, as well as in other ways about stories, like not what is told, but what is omitted. I want to speak to a little bit about what Lynne was saying there. I'm also really fascinated by like the internal workings of a cell. Biochemistry, it's my jam. I love those glucose transporters so much. I think they're so fun to study. ATP, oh my God. Yeah, it's so cool. And for a long time, I wanted to study medicine. That was kind of my goal. I applied. I got into interviews, and then I decided, oh, no, never mind. And so that's where I'm at now. And I think one of the reasons I decided not to focus on that side of the story, although I do care a lot about healing, and that is because I think there are lots of ways that we already have access to, that we don't need to investigate further into to heal. And that would be, things like social cultural factors, adequate housing, air pollution, water, food. And these things we know they influence people's health. And so like I think one thing that I want to end with here is just like asking ourselves and each other why we're doing something. My thesis right now is on like slow heart rate in rats. And why am I doing it? I think it's cool. I can tell myself it's because I want to understand hearts and see how that's applicable to everyone else as much as I want. But honestly, I think it's just cool. And I think we need to, just be a little bit sensitive about that and look at what we're prioritizing, what we think is cool, or like what we think is fascinating, or what will get the most money in a grant. Or are we like really putting our energy and our minds to what is maybe not the most shiny or dazzling solution, but one that might work just as well, or even better.
Thanks, Nafeesa. Wow, this has gone in directions I did not see coming, and I've learned so much in our time together. We're over time already, so sadly for me, but I would love to just go to each of you for either a closing thought about action, especially Sylvia and Lynne, you didn't get a chance on that question of how do stories move us to act. And I'll just do a very quick round, and then we'll start a Q&A, and I hope that folks can stick around. If you can't stick around for the next 20 minutes or so, then definitely check out the books that these folks have put out into the world. Nafeesa's book is untitled but please look us up. I'll put some online handles and websites in the chat, and so you can find everyone there. But I'll now turn back to this question of action or closing words and ask Sylvia if you could respond there.
I always want from a book that I write is for the reader to, at some moment, for a nanosecond, that's all would be fine, for them to go, oh, I hadn't thought of that before, or I hadn't thought of it like that before. So that's all the action I actually want from my reader, which means that they weren't utterly bored and they didn't, dislike it. So it's a low bar. But I think when we read stories, particularly stories about Elizabeth May, like seriously, who has been an activist since she was born, since before she was born. I think you can be inspired to say, I can do that too. Whatever, just the tiniest wee thing. Oh, I could do that too. Or I could rethink that too. So maybe that's it. Just when you read something, when you hear something, when you get inspired by somebody, the action is that you internalize it with some sort of, I could do something with that. That would be good for me. That's where I think stories can lead us.
And Lynn, what do you think?
Well, I think that by telling each of us, all of us, telling our personal stories as authentically as we can and listening to the authentic stories of others is how we can start to understand that many things we thought were unique to us are due to systemic problems. I think this is how women discovered some of the issues 40 years ago that were keeping us down, and came to understand them more by hearing each other's stories. And I think that's highly generalizable. So when I wrote my book, probably the farthest thing from my mind was trying to inspire others to action. I was simply telling my story. And I continue to be surprised when people tell me they were inspired by it, because I feel, really? Because it doesn't, that's not the goal. That's not where I'm coming from. But at the same time, I will say that I am frequently inspired by the stories of others. And when I slide into the doldrums of, oh, what's the point? Which I'm constantly battling, when I hear the stories of what other people are doing, I'm uplifted and inspired.
Yeah, I appreciate how this registers for everyone in different ways. I think it was just so wonderful to have all four of you share perspectives with us, and how each of you approached it in such a different way. Anu, Nafeesa, do you want to add any closing words before we go into a short Q&A?
Yeah, yesterday I was kind of thinking about what I was going to say today, and it finally clicked, like the light bulb went off. Oh, now I understand her title of Head, Heart, and Hands, and whether it's science, whether it's storytelling, whether it's art, we take what's in our heads, we transmit it through our hearts, and we get it out to the world through our hands. And so it's like, oh, that's what she was getting. And so thank you for making me realize that, and it all came together. And I'll just end with a quote from Willie Nolan Campbell, who's featured in One Earth and who was at the event that I hosted on Wednesday. And she says, "Telling our stories is the only way to get to the truth." Thanks again.
Thanks, Anu. Well, we don't have a lot of time left, and some of us do have places to go. Sylvia's granddaughter's graduation is coming up. Can we move to the question and answer for just a few minutes? Is that okay? So if you are thinking of asking a question, I would ask you to just reflect on whether this is a question that you think everyone is going to benefit from learning a little bit more on. And then I would invite you either to put it in our chat and I can read it out loud, or you can unmute yourself at this point and share as concisely as possible what your question is, because we're already close to the end of our panel time. Thanks, everyone. Do we have any questions?
I know I have a question primarily for Lynn, but also for the rest of you, Nafeesa possibly as well. And I think Sylvia touched on it too, but like that feeling of when you learn a bunch about stuff, particularly climate change. I'm definitely reading your book, Lynn, about like, I don't know what the right word is, but the I don't know, desperation is too strong a word, but the things that can make you feel a little bit not super optimistic. And I can relate to that feeling of like making it hard to relate to some people, like what you found have been strategies like for yourself in your inner life that have helped you kind of cope with that and those feelings that are not necessarily the most positive related to what you've.
Thank you, Casey, for that question and for reading the book.
Going to read the book. I haven't read it yet.
I'm looking forward to reading it. Okay. Whatever. I do find that it is something that I need to be aware of just about all the time, is the risk of falling into fear and or despair, because it feels that it's right there. But an awareness of that risk helps. And I think that what helps me the most is to just remind myself all the ways that I have been wrong, and I've been wrong so many times. And we do not know the future. We know that things can change in ways that we don't anticipate, and they can change very quickly. And to surround myself with people that are immersed in working on these problems and engaging in these problems in really different and creative ways, I find that the most uplifting and helps to sustain me. But I will say that it is, for me, it's something I struggle with all the time. But just to remind myself that there's lots of room to be humble, and I don't know the future, and I don't know all the things that can happen, and to remember, as a mutual friend of Cate and I is very fond of pointing out, the fossil fuel industry works very hard to help convince us that the appropriate responses are despair and lack of action. And that helps fire me up. We don't want them controlling how we're feeling and thinking about things. Damn it, there's lots of people quietly working behind the scenes, changing the world in really big ways. So.
Casey, can I just say that in the book that Cate and I did with Elizabeth May, that she is speaking to young people younger than you, is that the antidote to despair is to do something. And in her book, and us working with her for that book, Elizabeth just had these, I have to do this, I have to do that. And that drove her life. And I think it drives a lot of people's lives, is I have to do something. So in our book, that's the antidote to despair, is to get up and do something, whatever that is.
Yeah.
We have another question that's specifically for Anu, and it's about thinking about that quote that you read from Willie Nelson. What did you learn from telling your stories?
Willie Nolan. It's funny, I was listening to we were watching the video of We Are the World the other day, and so Willie Nelson did come into my, it's a fun thing to watch for a good blast from the past. What I learned from writing the stories is how many stories there are out there to be told, and how cool they all are. That was, I mean, the whole book process was really enjoyable for me, which I think isn't always the case for everybody. I really did enjoy it, but the best part, and I think the easiest part, was writing up people's stories, because it was just so cool to like dig into figuring out what the right question is to ask somebody that gets out this whole other thing that you didn't realize, that kind of connects all the dots. And it was neat to interact with them and see them kind of connecting the dots too, and then putting it all together in a little package that that shares a super inspiring story. So I think that's what I learned, was just the joy of being able to tell people's stories in kind of a bite-sized fashion. I mean, everybody has way more to say, but it was nice to just be able to do that and share that in that way.
Thanks, Anu. I think that I'll draw our Q&A to a close, because I know a couple of our moderators have things that they need to be getting on with in their day, and already seen that many participants have had to go. But I want to thank everyone so very much for generous words and thoughts and generous sharing space and being here together. Thank you again to Persephone Brewing, the Craft and Farm Brewery sponsor for today, whose donations are now going to be going into residential school survivor support. So that's awesome. And you can find all of our books at banyan.com. And with that, I will just say, have a beautiful rest of your day wherever you are.
Thanks everybody for showing up. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Banyan.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.